Well, I want to now cross over to my colleague, Agina. He has been standing by, ready to bring us additional insights from that conference. Abi, what exactly has transpired there today? Please bring us up to speed.
Well, many thanks for joining us. We are coming to you live from the KICC, where the Technical and Vocational Training Conference is underway. A lot of delegates taking part in this year's conference. And we want now to speak to the chairman of the Permanent Working Group, that is Dr. Kevit Desai, just to get some perspectives around training and what TVETs will be doing differently this year, bearing in mind that the performances in different levels in the Kenya Certificate of Secondary Education were not as expected. Many thanks, Dr. Perhaps let's just start off the interview with, take us through perhaps what this conference is aiming to achieve and how far, so far, is the participation looking like?
Well, we have excellent participation today. The objective of the conference is to bring all stakeholders together. The government, the private sector, the academia, the TVET institutions, the youth, and it's to ensure that we're able to then have systems and structures in order to address aspects of quality and relevance of TVET. TVET systems nationally are now on the verge of transformation. With the enactment of the legislation of 2012, which was the TVET legislation, there's a paradigm shift in terms of how we're going to have a TVET ecosystem. And the priority issue here is that we'll be introducing competency-based education and training, which essentially brings private sector and TVET institutions and government policymakers together on each skill in order to dialogue and engage on the requirements as far as occupational standards are concerned. Those will then determine the level and quality of skill, which will then be translated into curriculum and finally into all the other salient features, which include internships and apprenticeship programs. So it's this national ecosystem that has to be created. But in order for that to be achieved, we need such a conference to bring all stakeholders together, to bring the private sector together, to bring the government, the academia, the TVET institutions, and to dialogue and engage on how those structures will be created. How will it be a joint responsibility going forward?
And looking at TVET, it seems like their role in society is now becoming more pronounced, especially with the directives that the government is looking to pump in more money in TVETs. Perhaps what should you expect moving forward for TVETs now that we are seeing a lot of interest, a lot of students look forward to joining the TVET institutions? What's in the horizon, really?
There are three thoughts that come to my mind. The first is that TVET is an incredibly viable option for young people who drop out of high school or who simply have talent, imagination, and are good with their hands. These are special people, special youngsters, and they need to be embodied in a national system which ensures that accreditation and recognition is provided for these skills. They consist of masoners, they consist of technicians, electrical technicians, bus mechanics, automotive mechanics, hairdressing, cooking. All of these are vocational skills. They're extremely important, which leads me to my second thought. Vocational training is the fabric of our development. If you look at private sector development with 12 million people in business and 300 manufacturing units, our productivity depends on skills. With a good national ecosystem, we could raise the productivity gains by up to 30%, which is a phenomenal amount in these times, which could have a significant impact in terms of our prosperity. And finally, my third thought is that vocational training promotes jobs, prospects for youth. They're able to find themselves in careers that are enriching. With a national system consisting of the Kenya Qualifications National Framework, they're able to then create pathways into better livelihood and better prospects, including entrepreneurship. So the TVET reforms, the TVET discussions to date within this country are extremely important, but what needs to happen is that stakeholders need to commit. They need to commit to realizing that this is not the sole responsibility of government, but all stakeholders, whether they're private sector, parents who have a stigma towards vocational training and consistently as a culture send students their young children to universities need to see that this is a viable option. This is a viable option in terms of the passion of a child. Yeah.
Are we likely to see a demand in more young students going to TVETs now that the performance in the KCSE results were not as expected? What should we expect moving forward in terms of admissions in TVET institutions?
I think there will be an overwhelming appreciation, especially if the TVET system functions. If TVET is able to produce graduates with relevant and quality skills, and we address as a nation issues on access, which basically means funding. How does a young person get a loan to go to TVET institution? Issues on equity, to broaden the aspects of being able to allow different students from different groups, cultures, etc., and so on to participate. You'll see an overwhelming gain in terms of interest in this field, but it needs to be made exciting. It needs to be made relevant, and above all, it needs all past stakeholders to participate strongly in a determined way to inform structures and mechanisms that would promote results.
And finally, looking at TVET institutions in the country, they have suffered years of underfunding. What are we looking to do differently this year now that you're seeing a lot of interest coming through from different stakeholders?
If, as a nation, we are serious about growth, economic prosperity, social prosperity, then TVET is the way to go. And one of the most neglected aspects of our involvement in TVET is the funding it receives. It receives far too little to what the lost opportunity is in terms of the gains that it can provide in terms of productivity, job opportunities, and so on. Government needs to urgently prioritize funding for this sector to ensure that we're able to put it in the mainstream and the fabric of our development. We need to realize that today there are massive infrastructure projects taking place in this country, LAPSET, Northern Corridor, SGR. We need to take advantage of this opportunity and skill young people to engage such industries. The only way is to prioritize TVET, to see how we get the adequate funding that it deserves, and to see and make sure that we have a world-class skill systems, not only for Kenya, but also to ensure that we're able to play a complementary role throughout East Africa as far as development is concerned.
And finally, Dr. Kevit, of course, we've also seen a number of TVET institutions transitioning into becoming universities. And of course, the demand for higher education has been rising in the country. We're having students coming all the way from South Sudan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, just to study in Kenya, bearing in mind our education system is actually considered highly advanced. Perhaps how do we navigate this tricky position where we don't want some low-level or mid-level institutions transitioning into universities? How do we ensure we don't go down that path?
These are two separate systems of education. Universities promote education, research, skills development. Vocational institutions focus on skills. They focus on applied research. They're extremely important, both of them. Both of them add to our overall productivity gains and so on. What differentiates vocational institutions is that craftsmen and artisans and technicians are able to repair things in structured ways, machinery, maintain systems, be able to foretell failures, be able to improve machinery. And this is, in this particular context, we need to be quite adamant and focused that we do need a very vibrant vocational sector and TVET structure. Not only within urban areas, but in rural areas too, in order to create possibilities of employment and productivity gains and new business setups. It's critical, therefore, that as a nation, we realize that we may have decided to dismantle TVET institutions because we have created a stigma. We've, as parents and as a society, we feel that if you go to vocational institutions, you're a failure. Yeah. This is not the case. In modern countries like Germany and so on, they're essentially equal, if not better, than university education. And that's what we need to aim for, because this is a different kind of system, different structure, As parents, as a society, as culture, we need to lead ourselves to understand and appreciate that vocational institutions and vocational training is extremely important. It has to be recognized, and with the right national system that we're trying to create today, they need to acknowledge and appreciate and see how they're able to turn the tide going to university as opposed to vocational institutions.
All right. And lastly, Dr. of course, as we progress towards becoming a middle-income economy, there are still skill gaps that exist in the economy. Perhaps how can employers also break away from just demanding for degree holders when it comes to recruiting of new employees? How do we also stimulate more industries to be able to absorb the numbers that we are getting out of TVETs?
We've created a national system today which for the first time is trying to introduce competency-based education and training. There are various elements to CBIT, which means that the national structure in terms of policy and legislation and regulation requires private sector to participate in sector skills advisory committees. These are committees that bring practitioners, for example in welding, a person who has been welding for 5 years, into that committee. We have government in terms of policy and technical capacity. We have TVET, we have specialists from associations. They all come together in order to inform the standards that are required. Private sector has to be involved at that stage. It also has to subsequently be involved in creating apprenticeships and internships. They need to now think that in order to maintain and achieve greater productivity rates, they need to invest in education, they need to seek involvement. And by doing so, there'll be a collaborative approach to ensure that whenever a student comes for internships or apprenticeships or job opportunities, they're better prepared because they've been part and parcel of the training from the onset. And so this is a joint responsibility. There's no other way around it, because the dynamism of private sector is so frequent that it's impossible for a vocational institution to keep up. It has to be a joint commitment between private sector and vocational institutions in order to ensure there's alignment, relevance, quality, and then address issues of access and equity. We need to even go as far as helping vocational training lecturers come to our plants, our industries, our workshops, in order to appreciate where we are in this particular context. Many of these trainers have studied at vocational institutions and then gone on to train, not having been in industry. That's a huge loss, a huge dislink from the reality of the situation on the ground.
All right. Many thanks, Dr. Kevit Desai, just talking to us about some of the reforms that the technical and vocational training institutions are going through here in the country. Of course, a lot of optimism now in the country, especially among parents as well as policy makers, just to make sure that TVET institutions regain their lost glory in society. Back to you in studio.